This is the third public annual lecture of the Centre for Critical Heritage Studies, and the Centre of Critical Heritage Studies operates as an interfaculty research centre, and it is led by the Institute of Archaeology, of which I am director, hence why I am standing here, and it's supported by the UCL Institute of Advanced Studies in partnership, all of those named places, with the University of Gothenburg. So its general aim, and you've been participating in various events through the last 3 years, is that it will lead the way in defining a new field of critical heritage studies, which identifies and interprets evolving multi-scalar forms of heritage and identity and addresses issues of heritage justice. So that's a definition for you of critical heritage. I'd just like to also say that we've signed the next 3-year tranche of association with the Gothenburg overarching Centre of Critical Heritage Studies. So we've got another 3 years at the very minimum of enjoying events and collaboration between Gothenburg and London. Now I want to tell you a little bit about our presenter or lecturer. So you have Nick's title there, and Nick will be known to you and is known as the Chief Executive of the Horniman Museum since May 2018. When I looked up Nick a bit more, and I do know him a bit anyway, I was rather rolled over by the list of things he's chaired. He's quite a thingy chair. So the chair of the International Council of Museums from 2001 to 2004, president, not a chair, but president of the Council of British Archaeology from 2005 to 8, chair of the University Museums Group from 2009 to 13, convener of the Museums Association's Ethics Committee from 2008 down to 2014, and chair of the Collections Trust from 2013 to 17. So quite a lot of chairs, and I'm sure he'll chair himself very well through this presentation. I always like to know how people cot where they cot and how they became chairs of so many things. So he started at Cambridge, where he did his PhD, on widening participation in museums, which was published as Beyond the Glass Case. And in a way, you've never left museums, so some people just stick there, but maybe change in their orientation. He began his career in 1986 at the Museum of London as curator of prehistory, and big move here, subsequently head of the Department of Early London History and Collections. And he led a well-known project then called the Peopling of London. So he was basically, his first post was in a museum. He then, from 2004 to 16, this is a very short leadership thing, from 4 to 2006, he was a part-time fellow on the CLAW leadership programme, undertaking leadership training and development of cultural leadership. Then, and very importantly for us, he came to the Institute of Archaeology, University College, where he was Director of Museums and Collections and Reader of Museum Studies. And we've never really got over you leaving us, but you did stay with us for 8 years, and we're very proud and pleased you were with us. From then, Nick moved on to Manchester and was Director of the Manchester Museum. And he spent quite a chunk of time there because it's only more recently that he's come to the Horniman Museum. And very much involved with public engagement there. And you have written, or others have written for you, that you doubled the museum's visitor numbers to 450,000 per year. That's pretty incredible. So that just shows you what heritage can do when it presents itself in ways that are engaging and encouraging. So here is the topic for today, which Nick will be presenting. And it is really a shift in critical museology from something that's dominated by human-centered inquiry to other focuses, and in this case you can see it to be on climate and ecology. So he's influencing subject and practice in museums by looking at this other dimension and direction, and we look forward to hearing about it today. So there is no emergency to use the fire exit, but I think we're going to be alerted to crises and emergencies in other forms of museum practice as a subject. Over to you and welcome back.
Thank you. Sue and I were joking earlier about if you feel the climate emergency is overwhelming, you can use the climate emergency exits as well. So thanks so much for inviting me to give the third annual lecture on critical heritage studies. It's lovely to be back at UCL, and I realise, to my horror, it's some 13 years after I left. And Sue's given you a bit of a resume of what I did before and after my 8 or 9 years at UCL. Here I was very involved in establishing the heritage studies and public archaeology courses and taking another look at museum studies, and I was particularly pleased to try and integrate UCL's collections much more into the heart of what UCL is about, and I'm really pleased to see how that's been taken on and developed through UCL culture. As Sue mentioned, after I did the CLAW leadership program while I was at UCL, and then moved to my first museum directorship at Manchester Museum. And this is a global museum of nature and culture with collections of botany, earth sciences and zoology, as well as archaeology, anthropology and Egyptology. And when I went there, having been an archaeologist by training and a museologist, it was really the first time I began to think about environment and natural history in museums. And when I was there, it became clear that natural history collections could and should be used to tackle contemporary issues such as climate change and extinction. And in Manchester, we began to do a lot of programming on those. And last year, as you heard, I moved back to London to take up my current role, which is at the Horniman, which is in Forest Hill in South London. And I'll be saying a bit more about it in a moment, but one of the interesting things I realised is that it's the only museum in London out of several hundred museums where nature and culture can be seen side by side on a global scale, and that's very much influenced the direction that the museum is now going in. And when I was invited, very much out of the blue and to great pleasure, to do this lecture, my main starting point from my relatively new vantage point at the Horniman was the realization, or at least my impression, that there hadn't been a lot of museological thinking about some of the things that were preoccupying us there: the climate and environmental crisis, extinction of species, air and plastic pollution. And I realized in thinking about it that for most of the time since its emergence as a distinctive critical field in the 1980s, museum and heritage studies have primarily been human-centered subjects. And this is, of course, understandable because of their emergence from disciplines like archaeology, anthropology, and art history, with their focus on human activity and creativity, material culture, and the critical theory that generally has been brought to bear on them. In Cabinets of Curiosities, you'll all be very familiar with this, Ole Worm's cabinet of about 1655, nature and culture are undivided in the kind of proto-museum. Natural specimens, artificial and natural specimens, not really particularly distinguished except in terms of aesthetic arrangement or size. But with the Enlightenment, Judeo-Christian thought, of course, began to separate out nature and culture, allowing nature to be exploited, dominated, and controlled, seen as a hostile encumbrance to progress or a resource to bring riches. And it's the legacy of this thinking that has allowed delay in actions to tackle climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss, for Donald Trump's administration to disavow science and deny climate change, and Jair Bolsonaro to condone the accelerated destruction of the Amazon rainforest, to see it as a cash crop that can be of benefit to the economy of the country. And this separation of nature from culture has had a fundamental impact on the development of our own fields. For museums, it's led to the separation of dedicated natural history museums from other ones. For example, the British Museum was integrated with its natural history collections until they were hived off to form the Natural History Museum until relatively recently called the British Museum brackets Natural History, which opened in 1881. And even within global museums like Manchester Museum or like the Horniman, and most large regional museums, natural history has always been presented in separate galleries, often at quite some remove from displays of human cultures, which often lived in the same environments as are shown in those natural galleries. And here's some just convenient slides I happen to have. Manchester Museum's Natural History Gallery and a rather dim slide of the Horniman's Natural History Gallery, unchanged since the 1960s. When I was a PhD student, exploring museology, it didn't really encompass natural history and in the environment, particularly from a critical perspective. People who were natural history or earth science curators didn't seem to be theoretical. They were working within a scientific paradigm that had little truck with post-colonial theory, for example, but they were often doing vital practical work to highlight species decline, campaigning about the red list of endangered species, and gathering evidence for change and loss. And our natural history collections are, of course, an incredible data bank of biological diversity going back often 200 years or more, much of it from a time before much of the major extinctions that we've seen had set in. And our account of what critical museology is needs to encompass these kinds of narratives, these future-orientated narratives of preservation and rescue and scientific endeavour. Environmental education was and is seen as a vital function of museums, but it's usually, through its history, employed a top-down deficit model, best exemplified by what I can call a pre-plastic David Attenborough, which thought that education would lead to appreciation, which would in turn lead to care, and hence to preservation of species and their habitats. Freeman Tilden's 6 principles of interpretation, derived from his experience in national parks, has had a huge influence on museum and heritage interpretation, but it did assume a largely unchanging and awe-inspiring nature. His principle, that the chief aim of interpretation is not instruction but provocation, I'll return to later, but much of that thinking was about nature being separate and unchanging. There was, of course, critical museology brought to bear on natural history and environment, such as Donna Haraway's classic article on teddy bear patriarchy, but they tended to critique representations of the natural world from the perspective of what they said about society that had produced them, rather than looking at natural environment in and of itself. Hugues de Varennes' concept of the eco-museum and Peter Davis's subsequent work on them were all pretty much about human activities taking place within landscapes, often industrial ones, which was about preserving them and keeping them fairly static, often with a strongly nostalgic component, again with the main focus being on human interaction within a landscape background. For a long time, though, the idea that nature and culture can be seen as separate realms has been criticised, partly because we can't actually find anywhere on Earth, including the deep oceans, that has not been affected by people, particularly in terms of plastic and particulate pollution. And some scholars, such as Swing Dao, have suggested that the phrase nature should be better seen as socio-environmental arrangements. And I think that's an absolutely horrible phrase, but perhaps better, as Gandhi suggests, it should be replaced by the still rather clunky phrase, seeming nature. But I think we should learn to, this separation between nature and culture essentially isn't valid, although it's driven so much of museum practice and, I think, museological thinking. My contention, then, is that the historic nature-culture divide has affected all areas of museology, including the physical structures of museums, as I've said, and different paradigms of thinking between humanities and scientific disciplines in museums, and has led to a blind spot in museological thinking. I think this is particularly the case in the UK, because in, for example, North America and Australasia, partly because of the scale of landscapes and partly because of the activism of indigenous peoples, there has emerged a stronger impetus in trying to break down the divide. I'll explore some of these ideas in a moment, but first let me look at what the impact of the perpetuation of this divide has been. You could argue, actually, that it doesn't matter that much. After all, most museums do actually deal with human cultures, whether they're museums about particular people, particular kinds of material culture, such as fine art, or about human histories. There are relatively few natural history museums, and natural history galleries are far outnumbered by cultural ones. But I think it does matter, as you might imagine, for two reasons. First, I think the divide leads to a partial account of human history itself in museums. Accounts of slavery and colonial exploitation and the Industrial Revolution, in my view, downplay the devastation of environments through deforestation, crop planting and mining, and the slaughter of animals for the leather, horn, ivory and feather products we see in our museums. Products made or consumed in the UK from materials from the colonies, sugar, tea, coffee, rubber, oils, furniture made of tropical hardwoods, jewellery and so on, are separated from natural history galleries which present the products as pristine, as samples, separate from any supply chain, and they're also presented, as I said, separately from anthropology galleries showing the peoples from those regions. The rise of Britain as an industrial power in the 18th and 19th centuries, through to its apogee before the Second World War, was based on the taming and exploitation of the natural resources of its colonies. The great majority of the goods that people bought, many of them now shown in our local history museums, were made from natural materials from the colonies. But because of this separation between seeming nature and culture, our museums show the products innocently sitting on showcase shelves as examples of industrial production and consumption, and they might sometimes show the animals and plants from which they were derived, but they're usually silent on the processes that lead or led from one to the other. With last year's article, actually, by Subhadra Das and Miranda Lowe on Nature Read in Black and White, Decolonial Approaches to Interpreting Natural History Collections, one of the few and very welcome exceptions. This silence, though, has led to another, much bigger reason that it matters. Our slowness in confronting the enormity of the environmental and ecological changes facing our planet at the moment. I hardly have to convince you of this, but for my purposes, for rhetorical purposes here, it's useful just to remind you of a few facts which we gathered together recently for a staff workshop at the Horniman. Most people, scientists, agree we're in the middle of the sixth mass extinction phase, the last one being 66 million years ago. We're in the Anthropocene because of human activity. Last 5 years, the hottest ones on record. The UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has warned of the severe consequences of global warming going above 2 degrees centigrade, above in pre-industrial levels. You can read what a summary of those are. Even a rise of 1.5% is likely to put 20 to 30% of all species at risk of extinction. More than a third of the world's glaciers will melt before the end of the century. Most of the Arctic sea ice is going in the thickest parts. Coral reefs are hugely threatened, and we've already seen mass bleaching episodes. Tropical deforestation, which we've seen in the Amazon, is the largest single source of greenhouse gases from land use and agriculture. Millions, 500 million people live in areas of desertification, 2 billion in areas of high water stress. And air pollution, as I think possibly not getting the attention it derives. There's this shocking thing about placental pollution through particulates. 98% of the world's population now lives in highly polluted areas, and the WHO is calling a public health emergency alongside the climate and ecological emergency. And the impact of this amongst the population, particularly amongst the young, who are, some of whom are, I know, are thinking we don't know whether we should have children, is part of this global increase in anxiety that we're seeing. And as the WWF says, We are the first generation, globally at least, to know we're destroying the world, but we could be the last that can actually do anything about it. So the climate an ecological emergency and pollution of air and sea matter because they are an existential threat to us all. And to think about what these almost overwhelming issues may mean for museums, it's worth just reminding ourselves what the commonly accepted definitions of museums are. And you'll be all aware of this. This is just worth looking at. So one of the common ones you'll know is the Museums Association 1, very familiar. It's about collections, inspiration, learning and enjoyment, and they do stuff in trust for society. And the parallel global one is the ICOM 1. Again, it's a permanent institution, service of society in its development. It does stuff, including environment, for purposes of education, study and enjoyment. But to me, in the light of what I've just said, these begin to read as rather hopelessly inadequate. Inspiration, learning and enjoyment seem rather weak in the light of the challenges we're facing. Interestingly, again, I'm sure you've looked at this, ICOM proposed but couldn't agree on a new definition recently at its last month's Kyoto Triennial. I won't read it out, but it's part of the criticism was that it was actually quite long. But it does say it's about conflicts and challenges, and then it does stuff for society, and it's about the future as well, and then it does more stuff in partnership, aiming to contribute to human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being. So interesting that it wasn't agreed, and I think that was a tension between change makers and people wanting to hold to a commonly accepted understanding of what museums are. But even this, actually, apart from the references to the challenges of the present and planetary well-being, it seems to me that this still reveals something of a blind spot around climate and environment, with most of the emphasis being placed on social justice and human concerns. But it's generally acknowledged that social and environmental justice are inextricably interlinked. Wealthier nations and individuals are the largest emitters of carbon and the greatest polluters, while the poorer nations and people suffer disproportionately from the effects of climate change and pollution. So most environmentalists agree that tackling climate breakdown can only be done by simultaneously tackling social and economic issues such as poverty, human rights, the divide between the global north and south, and the gap between rich and poor within specific societies. And the climate activist movement around museums and galleries is also, interestingly, beginning to acknowledge that it's also necessary to engage with issues of racism and colonialism, seeing these as connected to climate issues. And in relation to this, it's interesting to begin to see a slight shift. I've noted that Iron Bridge Gorge, for example, is now being seen not only as the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, but also as the birthplace of climate change. And it could be that we're shifting perhaps towards a more integrated museology. And I'll return to that in a moment. Existential threats to museums, to the collections which distinguish them, to their buildings, to the people that work in them, and to their visitors. It's the greatest threat to the planet since nuclear weapons were invented. But unlike that threat, it requires not just high-level diplomacy, but a revolution in all aspects of everyone's lives. But we're still doing relatively little about it. In the recent edited volume on museum activism, of the 34 articles, only one deals with the climate emergency, and one with science museums and the issue of neutrality, in inverted commas, on sustainability issues. What I'd like to do now, though, is to mention some of the good work that is being done, because, of course, not everyone is ignoring this issue, and I'm pleased to say that UCL actually has a very good record in this area. The Institute for Sustainable Heritage, of course, has been for many years a pioneer in getting the sector to think about sustainability issues, and I think I first came across some of the key ideas around sustainability that have helped shape my thinking in a lecture that May Kassar gave about 15 years ago. We've always assumed that one of the roles of museums is preservation of collections and other assets in perpetuity. And we've assumed that there are scientific techniques to ensure that this can take place. But the changes to climate, the increase in extreme weather events, more fires, the spread of insects as temperatures increase, are all meaning we can't take this granted for any more. And the work of the Institute of Sustainable Heritage is forcing us to confront this. The Heritage Futures Initiative, also here at UCL, has been pioneering in looking across a wide range of future issues, including ways in which biological diversity is managed, looking at other types of heritage collections, seed banks, frozen collections, and generally at how the heritage of the future might look quite different from the 19th and early 20th century materialist paradigm that is still the mainstream. It's interesting that a lot of the thinking around this area has come from either within academia, as I've mentioned, or from groups outside the museum mainstream. Of the latter, the Climate Museum UK is a pop-up museum with an online presence, as they say, creatively stirring responses to the climate and ecological emergency. In the USA, an organization called the Natural History Museum, I think that name's already been taken elsewhere, but that's what they call themselves, is an activist art collective operating a mobile pop-up museum out of Brooklyn, trying to connect movements to museums and museums to movements. And this is one of their pop-up displays in a public space. Will the story of the sixth mass extinction ever include the role of its sponsors? So that's probably one you couldn't imagine in the Natural History Museum in London. And that's great that there are activists doing that and challenging the thinking. There's a really interesting Facebook group, if you don't know it, originating in Canada, called the Coalition of Museums for Climate Justice, highlighting current developments, with one of the founders being a museum educator called Douglas Wirtz, whose work I've long admired, and who I'll quote in a moment, and Robert Janes, who is probably the leading authority in relation to museums and the climate emergency. 10 years ago, his book, Museums in a Troubled World, was published as a passionate and very prescient plea for museums to engage with issues such as climate change and environmental degradation, to avoid being what he would see being totally irrelevant to contemporary concerns. Along with wider groups such as Extinction Rebellion and more specific groups such as Culture Declares Emergency, activists and protesters are raising the profile of climate and ecology and forcing museums to look more squarely at it. So what are museums doing? Well, they're mainly doing what they've always been good at doing. Most have environmental action plans or similar, particularly if they're a requirement of funding. And they've been trying to get their house in order through things like recycling initiatives, reducing energy consumption, and generally continuing to do business as usual, but more sustainably. They have, of course, been doing exhibitions as part of this, and this has been very good at raising the profile of environmental issues. When I was there, Manchester Museum did quite a good exhibition called Climate Control, which had objects and specimens, but one of the really interesting things about it is that it had a table which was staffed every day with a rota of researchers, scientists, PhD students and so on, working on climate change issues, who sat in the galleries and talked directly to members of the public about their research. It was great for their impact work and public engagement work, and it was really good for museum visitors to actually be able to engage with experts working on the cutting-edge issues around climate in a gallery space. And I think that was a really interesting initiative. There was an exhibition on extinction, and the Natural History Museum a few years ago also did an exhibition on that issue, which was great. Art galleries, of course, have been at the forefront because artists have been really active about climate emergency issues for quite a long time. You'll all be aware of the work of Olafur Eliasson, last year's melting glacier chunks called Ice Watch outside Tate, followed up by his current sort of retrospective exhibition again at Tate called In Real Life, showing a number of his kind of climate-related initiatives. And as you may be aware, he's helped curate a whole program, and indeed even the sourcing and menus of the food in the cafes and restaurants around themes of sustainability. Perhaps more recently, Bristol Museum, as part of the kind of climate action weeks, strikes and so on, has drawn attention to endangered species by cloaking them from the public, something that's been done in other museums as well. And I think what these exhibitions are doing is really embodying the Tilden principle I mentioned earlier about the chief aim of interpretation being not instruction but provocation. Quite often, museums are very good at presenting facts, a bit like the ones I've done, but those don't tend to result in action. It's these often more poetic and artistic and interventive things that have an emotional response that can have a bigger impact, perhaps backed up with some facts that can lead perhaps to action. On a much more practical level, Leeds City Museum has worked on making its exhibitions more sustainable. So they did one on animal makers, called From Beavers to Weavers last year, using recycled cardboard for all its graphics. Labels were printed, believe it or not, on a printing press that was held in the Industrial Museum collections, because sometimes you can use the collections, using handmade paper, activities in the gallery, used materials sourced from scrap, which was a creative reuse supplier. So innovative ways of just making more sustainable practice. This is a rapidly moving field, though. Last week's Museums Association conference, there we heard sessions on weaning ourselves off fossil fuels, mobilizing young people to tackle climate change, turning the tide on ocean plastic. There was a keynote from Thomas Clayton Muller, a senior campaigner for 360.org to end fossil fuel sponsorship and consumption in museums, and so on. V&A and other museums are, of course, also, being good museums, documenting the climate movement by collecting Extinction Rebellion ephemera and so on. All very good, but I want to suggest that this isn't enough. I've been in email correspondence with my colleague in Canada, Douglas Wurtz, who I mentioned, and he sent me back something which I want to share with you because I think it's absolutely spot on. It seems to me that very few museums have truly engaged with climate issues. I see museums wanting to seem like they're doing something positive, but always on their terms, creating exhibits or on-site programs on selected topics that contain contemporary issues or greening projects. And this is the thing, encouraging museums to shift from an outputs model of public engagement to an outcomes or impact model is more than most museums can wrap their heads around. And it's been a long-standing criticism of museums, and learning people are always banging their heads against the wall saying, why are we always in broadcast mode? Why are we not looking at enough? Why aren't we embedding impacts? But I think this is absolutely right in relation to this issue as well. So I want to look a little deeper into why museums, including those ones with biological collections where it should be absolutely central, are finding it difficult to shift from this outputs model to an outcomes one. So in addition to all the reasons I outlined earlier, one of the real barriers to this is what Robert Janes has called museums' adoption of a stance of authoritative neutrality. As he says, again, I quote, lest they fall prey to bias, trendiness, and special interest groups. Now, being a museum director with a board, I know this is an important issue for museum trustees and staff. The word trustee is very important. The high public trust in museums, shown in surveys, derives from the fact that they are long-term institutions with the public good in mind, over and above the shorter-term interests of politics. But of course, at the same time, they're reliant on politics and politicians for their funding decisions. But it goes that they are supposed to be non-partisan and unpolitical, even-handed and unbiased and neutral. But again, as I'm sure you know, all critical analysis of museums historically and today shows that they are not neutral. They've always reflected a partial view of history, usually in favour of the status quo and the more privileged social classes, Their founding histories are political, from General Pitt Rivers, who wanted to teach people that social evolution was the way of the world, so they wouldn't listen to scatterbrained revolutionary suggestions, to the proponents of the 1845 Museums Act, who were concerned to alleviate drunkenness by giving people an alternative to the tavern. Even today, as I've suggested, after 30 years of museology, we're still not telling a neutral story or a nuanced story about colonialism and slavery, for example. Nevertheless, museum senior managers and boards are nervous about taking a stance on contemporary issues because of this issue of authoritative neutrality. So let's look at what the Museums Association Code of Ethics says. Museum workers and boards ensure editorial integrity, resist attempts to influence interpretation by special interest groups, ensure that research is accurate and minimize bias. Now, that's absolutely wise advice when it comes to, say, accepting sponsorship from a company that might potentially influence the content of an exhibition. And it has to be taken into account when, if you're an art gallery, you put on an exhibition of an artist whose work will then be probably rise in value and then perhaps be sold. So those are all it's wise advice. But why should shouting louder about the climate and ecological emergency be a problem? The science is overwhelmingly clear, and as I said earlier, these are collectively planetary issues that affect literally everyone: museums, their staff, their visitors. I would argue that given such an existential threat, as institutions of the long term, able to place what's going on into a wider and longer context, it is an ethical imperative for museums to shout louder and to take action. The real truth, I think, is that museum workers and boards are very worried about offending potential sponsors and being seen to be political. But let's look at this. Given that actually many local authorities have themselves declared a climate emergency, and independent and university museums are freer to take action, but they have boards, I think a lot of this problem really resides with the national museums, with their powerful boards, their government funding, albeit arm's length, and particularly their high media profile, which means that doing anything gets a much stronger scrutiny than many other organisations would have doing the same thing. But things are changing even there, as you know, with some now no longer taking fossil fuel company sponsorship and debates going on about whether disinvestment from fossil fuel companies or other companies is appropriate. So my conclusion is that, sleepwalking as we are into the sixth mass extinction and an overwhelming series of climate changes, museums must engage as a sector with these long-term global issues. And because this crisis is so interlinked with exploitation and consumption by humans, and the impacts of these changes are felt disproportionately by the disadvantaged, it's inevitable that museums have to address social justice issues as well. Now, my next problem is one that I think isn't talked about enough or squared up to enough, which is one of our sense of proportion. In our conferences and our writings, museologists and museum workers can have a tendency to overclaim the impact of our work, convincing ourselves that what we're doing is going to save the world. There are, of course, wonderful, marvellous programmes undertaken by museums that engage and empower hard-to-reach audiences, like recent refugees or differently abled people, and they undoubtedly make a real and important difference to participants' lives. But if we're honest with ourselves, the participants in these projects are actually a tiny proportion of the museum's overall audience. The vast majority of our visitors come not to have their lives changed, but as part of an enjoyable outing with family and friends, within a context of learning something new and perhaps being inspired. We like talking about socially engaged projects because social change is part of the accepted discourse and reward system of museology, and we feel better about ourselves when we're doing this kind of work. However, we haven't found a way to translate this small-scale but important work into mass participation that makes a change in the wider society. This issue could be even more acute in relation to climate and ecology. What on earth, you could ask, do museums think they can do when the glaciers are melting and the rainforest is burning? So clearly, we need to have a sense of proportion. And it is a good question to ask, as it reflects the questions we ask ourselves as individuals and institutions. We want to do something, but in the face of the overwhelming nature of the issues, we kind of recycle stuff and try and cut down on using plastic and do the best we can. So we must be modest and realistic about what we can do in museums, but also focus on the contribution that museums can make as organisations. We are institutions with stewardship, conservation, the long term, and the public interest at our heart, so we do have a moral authority to speak. We do engage large numbers of people, about 100 million a year, more than go to church or go to football matches, apparently. So what can we realistically do? So far, as I've noted, we've mainly concentrated on an output mode. And there's nothing wrong with this, doing exhibitions and programs that highlight what's going on. There's now quite sophisticated thinking around messaging concerning the climate and ecological crisis to ensure that it's not too apocalyptic and people switch off. And I want to now give you, by no means claiming that we've got the answers, but to give you some examples of what we're trying to do at the Horniman, to give a bit of concrete examples to the rhetoric. So at the Horniman, our audience is predominantly families with young children, and we know from talking to the parents, grandparents and carers that bring them, that they're actually very worried about the future that these children will be growing up in and becoming adults in when we do or don't meet carbon reduction targets in 2030 or 2050 or whatever they may be. They want to do something but feel powerless. So it could be, with the climate and ecological issue, we have found an issue that's not of minority interest, with small but important impacts, or important impacts in a small audience, but actually important impacts in a mass audience, because there's a demand for it. So we've begun to engage with what we can do to meet this concern, where we have this major appetite for engagement. So in response, we've recently changed the Horniman's mission from its previous one, which was about appreciating natural environments and human cultures, to this one. Connects us all with global cultures and the natural environment, encouraging us to shape a positive future for the world we all share. So working together with the public and shaping the positive future for the world we all share is the really optimistic message, because we feel very strongly there's so much gloom and sometimes an overwhelming fear of despair. The idea that we can work together to shape something positive is so important to what we do. So we're now beginning to think through in detail what being a carbon neutral and biodiverse museum means. We declared a climate and ecological emergency in July, one of the first museums to do so, and we're now trying to embed that at a number of different levels. We're renaming our sustainability working group our Climate and Ecological Action Group, with a brief to accelerate actions. We're encouraging our staff to take actions in a personal capacity as well. We have a cycle to work scheme and so on, and we're introducing lunchtime sessions where we can share ideas about living sustainably. We're switching to green energy, to renewables. We're moving away from single-use plastics through the use of compostable serveware and free or canned water in our cafe. We compost 97% of our garden waste on site in our gardens, as well as the compostable material and food waste. We have an aquarium. We reuse nearly 187,000 litres of aquarium water for irrigating the grounds of it. And our aquarium, we're unusual, so not every museum could replicate that, but it's unique in being the first in the world to successfully breed coral in captivity. In our little aquarium behind the scenes in Forest Hill, we've now been able to breed successfully 6 times a year rather than once a year that happens in the oceans. And we're holding out the potential then to selectively breed coral to be more tolerant of warmer waters. And we're working with the Florida Aquarium to kind of scale up this work with the aim of beginning to repopulate bleached coral reefs long term with more warm water tolerant species. In our programming, we've developed a series of interventions, particularly around plastic pollution. And in our aquarium, last June, for a month, beginning with World Oceans Days, we've chucked a load of plastic rubbish in our tanks with our fish there. So you can probably see the poor little frog here surrounded by a load of plastic rubbish. We did, of course, make sure we tested that they were not going to be affected by it. Another poison dart frog there. And in we have a tank, a very beautiful tank with jellyfish circulating around. We took the jellyfish out, put them back of house, and circulate it with plastic bags that looked actually quite like jellyfish. And it was very shocking, because a reason it was shocking, I realised, that people assume that museums are going to look nice and pristine, and you won't go and see a load of rubbish in museums.